G'day from sunny but cool Melbourne, and I gather you're here to find out what the F1 drivers drove on the streets of Melbourne for the last race. If so, you're in the right place because I'll give you all the answers you're looking for in 8 seconds' time. The Australian Grand Prix takes place on a street circuit and only a few kilometres from the centre of Melbourne, the capital of Victoria. So all of the drivers drive to the track. They come in one entrance, and luckily I had Carly situated at the one and only entrance to the F1 paddock, and that's via Canterbury Road. This is the view that she had, and she managed to capture most of those drivers coming in. So let's get started with George Russell. He was driving a black GLE 63S, and yes, it's quite ironical that he is number 63 on the racetrack, and he's driving that particular model car. George was sitting in the back seat of this V8 bi-turbo. What are these cars worth? Well, there's no two cars that are ever exactly the same price because of so many different options, but as a guide, I found this one available in Australia at the moment. George's teammate Lewis Hamilton was also driving in the exact same car. And what is the route that these drivers take to get into the track? Well, it's simply from Canterbury Road here, following all the way through to the driver's car park, which is right outside the Melbourne Walk, and there's a short walk across the road to get to the walk. However, most of the drivers didn't park in the car park. They were dropped off at the top of the Melbourne Walk, except Lewis. Now, Lewis on a couple of days came in the far entrance of the Melbourne Walk, thereby avoiding all of the, and I'm guessing 1,500 to 2,000 people who are anxiously waiting for him. He did on Sunday do the Melbourne Walk, and he was dropped off at the top end. Let's jump to the Alpine drivers. Last year we had Oscar Piastri in an A110, but this year no such luck. Pierre Gasly arrived in this Renault Arcana, white in colour as you can see. Now I believe these come from Barry Burke Renault, which is a local dealership in Melbourne. They supplied the cars for the drivers and the team last year, and the same again this year. Now this is not a snappy sports car by any stretch of the imagination. It does 0 to 109.1 seconds, which is on the lazy side. They retail in this country for about 40,000 Australian dollars, which is US 27,000. And Esteban Ocon was in a Renault Megane, or a Megane, depending on where you come from. And every time I hear that mentioned, I always hark back to that magnificent line from Alan Partridge.
The Megane's slow pace really becomes a pain. Not my words, Carol, the words of Top Gear magazine.
What was the standout car this race? Well, there was one. And I won't get to it just yet, but it was on the thumbnail, and it absolutely blew me away. I'll come back to that. Lando Norris was in an Audi Q7, and on this particular day he was sat in the back seat. Why? Well, there was somebody else driving the car, but there was also a cameraman with a big camera sitting in the front seat, so I wonder where that vision will at some point pop up. Oscar Piastri was also in an Audi Q7. He enjoyed a great race with first time ever scoring points. Not a lot of them, but certainly happy to get on the scoring board, I'm sure. And on the Wednesday prior to the race, I had Oscar sign 50 prints from his very first race in Bahrain. I mentioned Esteban Ocon. He too did a signing with me of his magnificent win in Hungary up on the podium. And there are some of those still available, once again, from the shop at kimmelman.com. Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu were both driving Alfa Romeos, both driving Quadrifolios. These are the souped-up versions of this magnificent car. In this case, one was driving a Stelvio, that was Valtteri, and Zhou was driving the Giulia. And hats off to Valtteri Bottas for getting into the Aussie spirit, wearing thongs on a couple of days. Certainly on the first day, he and Paul Harris arrived in matching outfits with those, well, I won't say what they're called in Australia, those tank tops, stubbies and thongs. And he had plenty of supporters in the paddock too, including these three guys who were very much behind him with these VB t-shirts. And for those of you outside of Australia who don't know Australian beers, VB, being Valtteri's initials, is also the name of a very popular beer. It's been around for more than a century and is Melbourne-based. Were there any Ferraris being driven by the drivers? No, I'm afraid not. And it's been, well, I can't remember the last time I saw Ferrari drivers roll up in Ferraris. Certainly hasn't been this season. So what was Carlos Sainz driving? An Alfa Romeo Stelvio, blue in colour. I like the wheels on this model. He actually drove the car, and in Australia we'd pay something like 65,000 Aussie dollars for one of these, which is in the order of just over 40,000 US dollars. It does 0 to 100 in 3.8 to 7.2 seconds. And why is there such a difference in times? Well, that gets down to the engine, and the Quadrifoglio version is considerably more souped up, and hence it gets to 100 in much quicker time than the standard model does. Charles Leclerc was also in the exact same car, different colour, and he, like Carlos, drove their cars right up to the Melbourne Walk, changed drivers, and then the car was removed, and then they entertained hundreds of people along that Melbourne Walk. And I'm going to do a separate video coming up shortly talking about that, because it is a rather unusual feature of a Formula One weekend. There are only really 2 countries that put on something like this walk, Australia being one of them, and the other one is Austria. And was it popular? Oh yeah. It was wildly popular. People were sprinting from the gates, and I'll run through which of the gates to get to early if you want to get the best possible position. And those people would wait there anywhere from probably 6 hours before the first on-track session to 3 hours after the end of a session, in the hope that they saw their favourite driver. Now I'm going to get to the most interesting car, I thought, of the whole weekend. It was a Ford Raptor. There were 3 drivers driving it. Can you tell which ones they were? Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, and Daniel Ricciardo. And Daniel Ricciardo, late one afternoon, I think it was on the Saturday, ended up outside the paddock with a Ford Raptor, and there was a bit of a security throng keeping people away, but we were allowed to photograph, and he was doing some sort of video for this product. Now if you have a look on his jacket, this is not the standard Red Bull jacket. This has Ford on one of the breasts, and the other one has the Red Bull logo on it. So this is obviously as part of their partnership going forward with Ford. They're doing stuff now, and if you go back to rounds 1 and 2 this year, both of the Red Bull drivers were driving Fords of some sort, this being the most out there and the most visibly interesting model. And what do these sell for? Well, here you go, have a look here. Lance Stroll, yes, DBX again. These cars in Australia retail for around $400,000, or in fact start, which is about 270,000 US. It's a fair whack of brass, isn't it? And for the first time, I saw Fernando Alonso also driving a DBX. Lance actually parked in the car park and walked across the road, and on one occasion at least, he did the Melbourne Walk, and on at least one occasion, he walked the back route, which is this track here, and it allows, I guess, a driver to sneak in without having to do too much with the fans who are some 20 metres away. I have 6 drivers to go, and perhaps we go to Nick De Vries now. He arrived in a Honda CR-V. He parked in the car park and then was mobbed by fans on at least one occasion. Security weren't on the ball for that one, but I believe that was sorted out later in the weekend. And his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, for the first time this year, was in a Honda Civic Type R. This was the car that was driven almost exclusively by the Red Bull drivers and the AlphaTauri drivers all last year. And I can tell you the last 4 drivers were all driving exactly the same car, that being the Audi Q5. Alex Albon in a silver one. Alex had his trainer in the passenger seat, but he actually left his lights on in the car park one day, and they were on all day. Luckily for him, it didn't flatten his battery. Luckily for me too, because I did exactly the same thing. Why? Well, when you drive through the interior of the Melbourne track, you're required to have your hazard lights on, and so many people left them on all day in the car park. Here's Logan Sargent in a white Audi Q5. Kevin Magnussen driving this silver one. He drove himself on the first day all the way up the Melbourne Walk. Now, he didn't walk it, he drove his car up past all the punters. Got away with it on that day, but was told not to do it again. And finally, Nico Hülkenberg was dropped off in his Audi Q5 at the far end swipe gates, which meant not too many people on the Melbourne Walk got to see him, because he only did, I'm guessing, about 20% of the Melbourne Walk, and that was on the Sunday, and that was at the end close to the paddock. You now know what all of the drivers, plus Daniel Ricciardo, drove to the Australian Grand Prix in Albert Park. I now require a favour of you. Could you please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't done so, and I'm going to urge you to become a member. We have a whole lot of good stuff for our members. You'll find all of my digital images at prostarpics.com. I have a whole host of signed driver prints and a couple of team principals, although I think by the time you watch this, Toto Wolff will have sold out in quicker time than Fernando Alonso. Go figure. Why is Toto so popular? I don't know, but I'm delighted he is. Also at kimelman.com, you'll find my F1 photo books, a range of merchandise, and wall art. And that brings me to the end, so I'll say thank you for watching.
And stay passionate.
Fucking